This is the Living Vertizontal Podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
I'm Natasha.
I'm Brittany.
I'm Derek.
And we are the Living Vertizontal Podcast with you this week as we continue our journey through the Gospel of Luke. In our episode last week, we moved on in Luke chapter 7, verses 18 through 23. And in this passage, we saw John the Baptist send his disciples to Jesus to ask an important question. That question being, are you the Messiah that we are looking for? Together, we discussed the different possibilities as to why John the Baptist would be sending his disciples to ask this question. And we ultimately landed on the idea that while there was 4 options, all 4 of them we could see maybe had a place to fit, maybe had a role to play as well. And we recognize that there is validity to each, and in that validity, maybe there was actually value in the ambiguity that existed. And ultimately, it brought us to this place of recognizing just how important it is for us to humbly come to Jesus to get to know him. This week, we're going to be continuing. We will remain in the 7th chapter. So we'll be exploring Luke chapter 7, verses 24 through 35. And in this passage, it continues on following this questioning from John's disciples, and Jesus begins to speak about John the Baptist to those that are around him, and he calls out the fickle nature of so many of those who were gathering. We have Brittany reading for us today. So Brittany, could you read Luke chapter 7, verses 24 to 35?
Yes. Luke 7:24. After John's disciples left, Jesus began talking about him to the crowds. What kind of man did you go into the wilderness to see? Was he a weak reed, swayed by every breath of wind? Or were you expecting to see a man dressed in expensive clothes? No. People who wear beautiful clothes and live in luxury are found in palaces. Were you looking for a prophet? Yes. And he is more than a prophet. John is the man whom the scriptures refer when they say, "Look, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way before you." I tell you, of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John. Yet even the least person in the kingdom of God is greater than he is. When they heard this, all the people, even the tax collectors, agreed that God's way was right, for they had been baptized by John. But the Pharisees and experts in the religious law rejected God's plan for them, for they had refused John's baptism. "To what can I compare the people of this generation?" Jesus asked. "How can I describe them? They are like children playing a game in the public square. They complain to their friends, 'We played wedding songs and you didn't dance, so we played funeral songs and you didn't weep.' For John the Baptist didn't spend his time eating bread or drinking wine, and you say he's possessed by a demon. The Son of Man, on the other hand, feasts and drinks, and you say he's a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and other sinners. But wisdom is shown to be right by the lives of those who follow it."
All right. Thank you for reading that for us today, Brittany. Let's go ahead and move into this conversation. As was alluded to in the intro and also read by Brittany, this scene that we're going to be discussing right now, this interaction that Jesus is having, takes place following John the Baptist disciples leaving. So Jesus, they approach Jesus. They ask Jesus the question that John told them to ask about, are you the one who is to come, or should we be looking for someone else? Jesus answers that question, and they have now moved on. And even though they have moved on, Jesus has not moved on from the conversation of John. And so he now turns to the people that are there with him to use this as an opportunity to talk about who John is, and even hold a mirror up to who they are in the midst of this conversation as well. So as we look at this, what are we seeing? What's standing out to us as we get this conversation started?
So I think as Jesus asks these questions of the crowds that are gathered around, I think he's pointing or trying to point out something within them, maybe an expectation that they had as he asks them why they gathered to see a prophet. I think that they were expecting to see a prophet other than John. They were expecting to see Elijah, that he would be the one that comes and prepares the way for Jesus. And so this is an opportunity for Jesus to really point to the role that John played in Jesus coming, in this ministry that he has had up to this point, and that Jesus is the way.
Yeah, and he does this by asking these rhetorical questions. He says, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swaying in the wind? Otherwise, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes?" And as I was reading these, I was just wondering, okay, Jesus, what are you talking about here? Is there some sort of symbolism we're supposed to be picking up on? I don't know. What did you guys find about that?
So one thing that we talked about at our table was just each of these statements or each of these questions that Jesus is asking points to a particular type of person, potentially, that somebody may go to see, right? To learn from. And so this idea of someone being represented by a reed swaying in the wind, like this is somebody who is maybe an influencer of sorts, but is easily influenced by the currents and the streams of culture going on around them. And so they're kind of just going to go with the flow. Maybe they speak well, maybe they say catchy things, but ultimately they're in line with the current of culture.
They're the trendy prophet.
Trendy prophet. That is a good way to put it. So yeah, so a reed swaying in the wind, a trendy prophet.
Or maybe not so much prophet. I don't know if they're
a trendy somebody, right? Of some sort. And then the next one is a man dressed in fine clothes. Like this is identifying, somebody of like an influential position, somebody maybe who is wealthy, somebody maybe who royalty even. And so just by nature of their like standing in life or their position in life, they have some kind of influential sway over others. And so essentially, like Jesus is asking, did you go and see somebody who is a trendy influencer? Did you go and see somebody who is a positional influencer? No, that's not who you went out to see. That's not what this was about. That's not who John was. And that's not who John was. But then he kind of goes into, well, then who was John?
It's very similar to John's disciples had come to Jesus to ask if Jesus was who they should be expecting. And, Jesus gave his spiel about who he is. Mm-hmm. And it's like Jesus is also using this to kind of tell who John is in the same way. Like he's not what you expected, but God still used him.
Yeah. I mean, and with that, like John's disciples ask who he is. He puts himself in line with prophecy. And then when he goes to talk about who John is, even though John's not who they were expecting, in a moment, we'll see that he puts him in line with prophecy. And in so doing it, he's also continuing to answer the question of who he is because of who John is.
It's a defense of both who Jesus is and who John is.
Right.
And Jesus even alludes to Malachi 3:1, where he says, where it says, "I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me." And so Jesus is calling back to Malachi to point to who John is, the one who has prepared the way. At this point, he has already prepared the way. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus is affirming the role of John and what John's been called to do. And at the same time, essentially affirming the role that he has by being the way.
Yes.
And then, as a part of this defense, I think Luke, who's writing this gospel, who's recounting this story in as great a detail as he can, doesn't miss a moment to incorporate defining what this kingdom is and just how upside down it is, which fits perfectly here because we've just talked about missed expectations, right? Or misplaced expectations. And so in verse 28, he goes on to talk about, or Jesus goes on to declare how John is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. There's no one greater than him. And yet then he says, but yet he's the least. And so again, emphasizing this theme that we've been talking about for the duration really of this podcast through Luke, where Luke is continuing to establish, Jesus is continuing to establish that his kingdom is not like the world. It doesn't make sense. The people, the players you think are going to be the main players, they are not the main players. Like everything is upside down. Everything is unexpected. And it's really, it's the little people, like the people who feel that they have little to offer. Those are the people that are really great assets to the kingdom.
Yeah, as I read this verse, so verse 28, I actually, in my midweek meditations, how we go through and we characterize, but then we also we'll underline or circle the passage in the first couple times through. I underlined it, but then next to it, I wrote this kind of long note, but I built on it as I read through it different times. The first time I read verse 28, I just wrote confusing, ... But then the second time through, I was like, but it fits Jesus's upside down kingdom, much like what you were saying, Natasha. And then the third time through, I said, John is clearly great. So it's weird to say that even the least is greater. John is clearly great, but the least is somehow greater. And as I thought about that more, I began to understand, or I began to think, Jesus is acknowledging, and this is much like what you're in line with what you were saying, Natasha. Jesus is acknowledging that this kingdom of his is meaningful for everybody. It's not just meaningful for the great John the Baptist, but it's meaningful for everybody. And in this statement, he's not putting John down, but rather he is lifting others up. And so these people that are standing around, that are hearing what he has to say, who are so used to being stratified based on what they have to offer, based on their selection by a rabbi, based on their occupation, are now hearing this rabbi make this radical statement where he has now just elevated every single one of them. They have been watching John. They see the things that John has been capable of and the things that he's been accomplishing. They all think, man, John is great. And yet now they've just heard Jesus say, and yet you are greater.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredible. And it's so backwards to the kingdom of that day, because that day, rather than elevating people, you put people in their place. And as Jesus places people, he's lifting them up.
Well, and I mean, you mentioned that about Jesus's day, as if that's somehow different than today.
That's true.
But really, I mean, we have this hierarchy. We have it in the world, but we also have it within the church.
In the church.
It bleeds into every aspect of our culture and our life. And I think this is a really good call back to this kingdom and who it is that, like you said, who it is that Jesus is looking to elevate. And as Jesus's hands and feet, we as the church should be listening and looking for those that Jesus would elevate, those people that are the least, that would be considered greatest, and to be looking around for them and to proclaim that truth and that good news to them, that they are great in God's kingdom, that his kingdom, it doesn't look anything like anything we've ever experienced. And it's unexpected and it's exciting and it's empowering. We talked about this a little bit with the kids as well, because, the kids they're the people that sometimes, man, they just hear the clearest from Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Holy Spirit speaks to them in ways that he cannot get through, I think, to me, because I have all these preconceived notions and expectations that cloud, I these filters maybe that seem to cloud his voice. I don't want them to, I want to be free of those things, but inevitably they do. Life's experiences have taught me certain things that they taint what I hear from Jesus. And the kids, they come with these pure hearts and these like open minds. And it's just incredible what Jesus is able to speak through them. And so, they would be considered least, right? In our society, like the children still today, are of, less value. Their opinions matter.
Decision-making
right.
matters.
Yeah. And anything important, their opinions matter relatively little in church decisions. Like we don't see a lot of kids sitting on our boards. But this is how, like, these are the least.
Yeah.
And they see Jesus's activity so clearly in our world that we've got to give them space at the table to be able to share, what it is that Jesus is doing in the world around them, what he wants to do, because they have important things right now to add to what Jesus is doing. And so I don't know. I feel like this for anybody who feels that they don't have something to contribute, that they don't have something to add, that they aren't educated enough, or that they've made too many mistakes, or whatever it is that's making you feel low or least.
Inadequate.
Yeah. Remember, this kingdom is different. It's upside down. And in Jesus's kingdom, he speaks and does incredible things through the least. And that makes you right now, as you are, a powerful asset to God's kingdom.
I also, as a part of this upside down kingdom conversation, we see the humility of Christ to place value on the least, on the people that we would seemingly, much like you said, dismiss. And I think that's a great thing to take forward, like as the church. Like if this is what the greatest in this kingdom did, was live in humility and in service to others, like that should be the call for each of us, is to live in humility and service of others. And so I think, like, much like you said, that this would be a mirror, like Jesus gave us the mirror to look at of what we should be doing in this upside down kingdom, placing value on everyone, no matter how they've been, God's chosen to work through them, they still have great value. They are of greatest value. And so how can we be serving in a humble, Christ-like manner those who are considered the least among us?
The other piece that I find interesting about this verse 28, and maybe it's not necessarily verse 28 in particular, but the conversation that we're having here, the thought that goes through my mind is, like, John was not about self-promotion. I mean, we even see that in the question that we talked about last week, right? He's sending his disciples to go talk to Jesus, not so that way he could be carried further along, but so that their focus can be where it ought to be. And John, the last time that we encountered him, when he was going to baptize Jesus, like, he even talked about how, like, his function was to point. His function was to prepare the way, and he did that. Like, he wasn't about promoting himself. He wasn't about furthering himself. He was about pointing people to the one who was to come, to make a way, to prepare the way for that one to come. And so he's not about self-promotion, but then Jesus comes and speaks about him and elevates him in his speaking about him, right? Among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. Like, Jesus lifts him up. John points to Jesus. John doesn't promote himself, but Jesus lifts him up. And in the same way, you have all these least in the kingdom. Jesus lifts them up. Like, this life that we are called to live as we are in pursuit of Jesus is a life of pointing to him, and it's definitely not a life of promoting ourselves. Like, we don't have to try to get people to notice us. In fact, if we are working to the end of trying to get people to notice us, we're going about this the wrong way. We're walking a dangerous line in a way. Jesus in Philippians, we're told by Paul, he lived this life of humility, and we've talked about this, the kenosis of Christ, and in being very nature God, like he had every right to be self-promoting, but he didn't. He continued to be self-denying. And then in the end, ultimately, his Father exalted him and glorified him, and so he did the lifting, but it wasn't Jesus lifting himself up. And if Jesus is this model for us, if John can be understood as also another example for us, like we have examples of people who lived lives that were absent of self-promotion, but full of self-denial. And they weren't glamorous, they weren't beautiful or like eye-catching and exciting, but they were faithful to what God was calling them to. And in the same way, this is the life that we are called to. Maybe it doesn't sound super exciting. Maybe it actually sounds terrifying. I mean, I guess I'm a little terrified about it. But this is what we're called to. Like, this is what it means to count the cost. This is what it means to pick up our cross daily. Not to promote ourselves, but to point to Him.
It reminds me of, we had the pleasure of having the teens meet at our house over the last year. And it reminds me of something that was talked about while they were at the house. They were talking about being a window and about, you notice, you'll notice when a window's dirty, the light that comes in is a little dimmer. If the window has a covering on it, then not as much light gets in. But when you pull away, take away the coverings and clean the window, you have a clear view of the light that is shining through. And if we have to maintain that clean window, we have to take away our preconceived notions, our expectations, so that light can shine through and we can just get out of the way, because nobody's saying, oh, look how clean that window is. They're going to say, oh, look how bright that light is.
Mm-hmm. And so in Jesus's acknowledgement or elevation, lifting up of those listening, the next verse, you see further elevation of people who don't deserve to be elevated by all standards of the day, because everybody hears this, and even the tax collectors acknowledge God's justice. What do you guys think about that?
I get this really weird picture of this because I imagine that there's all the common folk that are cheering and saying, yeah, that's right, man, like in this crowd, right? And then you have all the high and prestigious, so like the Pharisees and experts, all of the people that are the haves, that are the greatest, that are just like, boo, boo, give us something else, and it's this weird dichotomy of where you see like the kingdom is so disruptive. Mm-hmm. It's so disruptive, and it doesn't intend to be divisive, but the people in position of authority or in position of power, if they reject the humility required of the kingdom, then it creates this tension and conflict that Jesus doesn't intend, but it's inevitable because it doesn't fit in his kingdom.
Because as we've talked about to this point, like his kingdom runs on humility and surrender and dependence on him, on the Father. And I mean, at the core of that dependence conversation is humility. Like, I have to recognize that, like, I can't do this. I need him. And if I can't come to the place where I say, I recognize my need for him, then I can understand how difficult it would be for me to find harmony within this kingdom. It would be like trying to be a part of another kingdom that is founded on a specific principle, but I reject that principle. Like, I just wouldn't fit. I would stick out like a sore thumb. In fact, the king would probably throw me out because I would be a nuisance to the kingdom that they are trying to instill.
Well, that's what Jesus, him coming and talking about this upside down kingdom really disrupts, like you were talking about, and it threatens these Pharisees and experts in religious law. It threatens their positions. It threatens their livelihood, much like when we talked about when Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and they were already, that's kind of when their position changed, because the things that he was saying, the things that he was doing, was directly threatening to all that they really believed in, because they truly believed in the law, and they believed in the prophets, but the law was king. And for Jesus to come in and everything that he's saying is so disruptive to their way of life and their thoughts. I mean, I can understand why they would be having these issues. And if we hold the things that we have so tightly, that when the truth, we're faced with the truth, that we rebel against it, that we push so hard against it, we're going to miss what's right in front of us. And that's what the Pharisees, they were missing the truth because they held that law so tightly.
And you mentioned that, but Jesus is just preparing them for the inbreaking of this kingdom, because fast forward, just a little bit here, and they're going to encounter Pentecost. They're going to have the Holy Spirit unleashed, which means they have the law written on their hearts. And this is now something that, like, it renders these positions obsolete. You don't need someone to help you know what the law is when you have God living inside of you, writing this law on your heart. And so it's an inevitable piece of the inbreaking of the kingdom, and it's like they don't want it, because instead of choosing to embrace it and change with it and find new purpose and meaning in God's kingdom, they've decided to hunker down in their spot and refuse to allow the inbreaking of this really, really good thing.
We're so amazed by the rejection of the gospel, and yet they had the fulfillment of the law in front of them and rejected it. Not to say we don't have the Holy Spirit here working, much like you just said, Natasha, in us and through us, but they had the fulfillment of the law in front of them and still rejected it. And so I don't know why I get so shocked when I see people rejecting the gospel, and yet I still have that desire, much like Christ did, to continue to present the truth, continue to present the truth, continue to try to work to see the inbreaking of the kingdom. And yet there's still rejection.
So as I was thinking about verse 29, that word justice really sticks out to me. And I went and looked up, Google AI overview definition of justice. Justice refers to the concept of fairness and impartiality, particularly in the application of laws and the treatment of individuals. Fairness and impartiality as it relates to the treatment of individuals. And when I think about that statement and then pair it with this statement that Jesus has just made, where he has elevated everybody within this kingdom that he is instituting, people are recognizing just how fair Jesus is, just how equally they're being treated. They the definition goes on and says, justice emphasizes treating all individuals equally and without bias, regardless of their background, status, or other characteristics. This is something that is so foreign to them. They have never experienced this. And yet Jesus is proclaiming this over them. And I'd imagine this is like people are being set free. They're being set free of of expectations. They are being set free of the labels that have been placed on them. They are being set free of the things that have been tied to them because of their history. Because Jesus sees them clearly. And as you guys were talking about, like the Pharisees and the experts in the law, they can't accept this because it's a threat to their position, because they've worked hard to get to that position of influence. And now you're telling me that me and that man over there are on equal footing here in your kingdom? I don't want to accept that. I don't want to give up my place of influence, my place of authority, my place of power. That's not appealing to me. But man, can you imagine what it would be like if God's justice really did break in through his church today? That people around us who have been shackled by expectations, have been shackled by what people have identified them as, what people have been shackled by, what history they have lived through. Could you imagine if God's justice broke into people's lives through the church? People would be so overwhelmed. They couldn't deny. And that's exciting, but I also get a little bit choked up because I'm broken over the fact that that's not happening. Even within the church, we have such a hard time of really understanding what it would look like for God's justice to break through, because we've even stratified people. We have put them in their place. We struggle with looking past their past. And we refuse to allow everybody to be on the same footing, regardless of their history, their experiences, their education, their life. Jesus, we need you now more than ever. Like, as the church, we need you to call this out within us and empower us, right? I don't want to just be stuck in this sad, broken place, but empower us to be people of your justice. And justice doesn't mean we are setting people right. It means we are seeing people right. Seeing people as you see them. Help us to do that, Lord. On this concept of expectations and the expectations that we carry, we jumping back into our passage for today in verse 31, we see Jesus begin to work out this conversation of expectations that the crowds had between who John ought to be and who Jesus ought to be.
Yeah, they've come like already, or Jesus alludes to like accusations that they have made about them, about John and about himself, and expectations that they've placed for the roles that John and Jesus have fulfilled, and they haven't met those, so to speak. Like, they haven't lived up to what the Pharisees and the teachers of the law have set in place for, or even tradition has set in place for who they're supposed to look like.
They didn't check the boxes.
Yeah, they didn't check the boxes. I feel like that's something we probably can easily fall into, people not meeting our expectations for how they should walk or what it looks like to walk as a part of the kingdom. And how easy it can be to fall into that trap that the Pharisees and teachers of the law have fallen into. And yet, like, there is it goes back to that humility aspect, like, as a part of being part of this kingdom. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to set everything that you know or you thought you knew or everything you've brought into this, these presuppositions that you've made, you have to set them aside, because everyone in this kingdom is not going to look the same. That's the beauty of this kingdom. We're not all like robots that have to look identical and everything has to be exactly the same. And I love that God has placed a call on the life of John, and John lived into that call regardless of what anybody else thought.
Mm-hmm.
And God had a role for his son in being the incarnate Christ who would come and live out this life of perfection, and would live it all the way to the cross for each of us. And they lived into these roles regardless of what anyone else thought. And maybe that's my takeaway for me. Like, regardless of the expectations that others put on me as a follower of Christ, I'm only trying to please one. Like, life is too short to try to meet the expectations of other people. And even Christ, like Jesus alludes to it, but wisdom is vindicated by all her children. Like, those who come behind him, who are living this life that he has called them to, will point to the truth that he has talked about. And it can be the same for us. Like, we have that ability to point to the truth of who Jesus is by the life that we live, by living into this kingdom that is different than what they have pictured in their mind.
At the kids' table, we took this verse 35 and kind of turned it into like what would be a modern way maybe to say this, but wisdom is vindicated by all her children. And kind of what we boiled it down to was, well, you just wait and see. You just watch, and I feel like that's kind of how Jesus wraps this up here. He's kind of like, look around. You just watch. Pay attention. You paying attention? Because you just watch. And I mean, if you look, we've talked a lot about the fruit. If you look, the fruit is there. And it's not there in full. It's coming full throttle here real quick. But I mean, really, Jesus he's looking and he's saying, you guys haven't bought in yet. You watch. Pay attention. Because it's big, and it's going to be big. And I think today, when we're looking around, Jesus is still speaking through people. He's still speaking to people. He's still very, very much active in our world. And we need to be paying attention to the wisdom that comes from the people he's speaking to. And pay attention. Watch. Because when you start to see the fruit, you'll know. And you better jump on that, because that's where he's moving and that's what he's doing. And you better set your preconceived notions aside, because rest assured, it's going to be probably unexpected. Rarely, I feel like, does Jesus do it in the, typical traditional fashion that I pray or that I lay out for him. Usually he's got something totally out of this world that I couldn't even have imagined or dreamed of.
So, I mean, as I'm hearing what you're saying and what we've kind of talked about around this table today, I guess it seems like the invitation is for us to check our expectations at the door this week of how Jesus ought to act, what he ought to do, what this kingdom should look like. Check our expectations at the door and sit humbly, expecting that he's going to show us what his kingdom looks like this week, in us and through us.
As you journey with us, we recommend purchasing Midweek Meditations, A Journey Through Luke, Part 2, which is available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizano podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.